It was early morning, June 6, 1944. In the grey dawn, a soft mist rolled over the channel, the kind of mist that soldiers later said felt like the world holding its breath. In a small German headquarters bunker outside, St. Lo Major Wilhelm Krauss was pouring his first cup of coffee when a young signals officer burst in, eyes wide. "Herr Major," he stammered, "enemy landings, they're saying Normandy." Krauss frowned. Normandy? That didn't make sense. The real invasion, if it ever came, would be at Pas de Calais. Everyone knew that, even the Führer himself had said it. The report must be wrong. Across occupied France, German officers woke to the same message and the same disbelief. Radio stations crackled with panicked reports. Enemy paratroopers near Saint-Omer-Église, landings reported near Vierville. Yet the information was chaotic, fragmented. No one could tell what was true. In the Führer's headquarters at Berchtesgaden, Hitler was asleep. No one dared wake him. By mid-morning, reports were multiplying. Thousands of ships off the Normandy coast, bombers darkening the skies, entire divisions of Allied troops pouring onto beaches, code-named Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. But even then, many in the German command believed it was a diversion, a feint to distract them from the real invasion at Calais. The deception had worked too well. As the day unfolded, the thunder of war echoed across northern France, the sea churned by gunfire, the sky filled with the scream of engines and the earth itself trembling beneath artillery. And yet hundreds of miles away, in offices and bunkers, German officers still thought it would all soon be over. A few weeks later, many of those same officers would be sitting in Allied prison camps, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. In their hands, newspapers printed in English stars and stripes, the Times, the New York Times. Each headline screamed the same thing: Allied landings in France. Successful. They would read slowly, carefully, eyes tracing maps of Normandy casualty counts, lists of divisions, and what they saw on those pages froze them. Because for the first time, stripped of propaganda, lies, and military pride, they saw the war for what it really was. They saw how enormous D-Day truly had been. And in that moment, the truth hit them harder than any shell. Germany had already lost. They just hadn't realized it yet. The morning of June 6, 1944, began not with the roar of artillery, but with static, the kind of electric crackle that made radios hiss and hearts pound across occupied France from Cherbourg to Le Havre. German signal operators strained to make sense of the flood of messages. Some were authentic. Many were not. Reports of enemy paratroopers and naval bombardment poured in from dozens of locations. Some units insisted the landings were small-scale raids. Others described thousands of ships. None of it fit the German understanding of what a real invasion would look like. In the early hours, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief West, tried to contact Berlin, but the lines were jammed, the reports contradictory. He needed one thing above all else: Hitler's permission to release the Panzer Division's Germany's armoured fist. But that order never came. At Hitler's headquarters, the Führer was still asleep. His aides, terrified of waking him, stalled. By the time he was finally informed, precious hours had been lost. Inside the bunkers along the Atlantic Wall, confusion turned to disbelief. The vaunted coastal defences built over years were being overrun within hours. Officers radioed for Luftwaffe support. None came. They asked for reinforcements. The roads were clogged, the bridges destroyed by Allied bombers. Major Krauss, still huddled over his field map near Saint-Lô, kept shaking his head. "This can't be the main landing," he muttered. "They're trying to draw us north." He wasn't alone in thinking. So, every layer of German command, from local battalions to the Peopleos, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, believed Normandy was a diversion. Allied intelligence had made sure of that. For months through Operation Fortitude, the Allies had staged one of the most elaborate deception campaigns in history. Fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, and even a phantom army, supposedly under General Patton, had convinced the Germans the invasion would come at Pas de Calais. So, when the real invasion struck not at Calais, but in Normandy, the Germans were caught looking in the wrong direction. By the time the truth began to dawn, it was already too late. From the cliffs above, Omaha Beach artillery officers watched the unimaginable. Wave after wave of landing craft, so many they seemed endless, disgorging troops, vehicles and supplies, under a sky filled with Allied aircraft. One officer later wrote, "The sea itself looked as if it were moving. It was alive with ships." Deep in the command bunkers, the mindset hadn't yet shifted. They still thought the Allies could be thrown back into the Camality Sea, as they had done so many times before. What they didn't yet understand was that this was not another raid. This was the largest amphibious invasion in human history. And even as German officers scrambled to piece together the reports, the tide of war was already turning quietly, inexorably against them. By the second day after the landings, June 7th, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were a graveyard of steel and smoke. German defences, once thought impenetrable, had been shredded by naval guns and relentless air power. But amid the chaos, scattered pockets of resistance still fought with ferocity, machine gun nests firing until the barrels melted artillery pieces, firing until the crews were gone. In those desperate hours, the first German officers fell into Allied hands. Near Carentan, an American paratrooper unit cornered a group of Wehrmacht officers trying to regroup. They were stunned not by their capture, but by what they saw on the way to the prisoner collection point. All around them lay the wreckage of an army that had never expected to be hit with such precision. Columns of Shermans and Cromwells thundered past supply trucks, rolled inland without pause, and the skies above buzzed with aircraft, so numerous that one officer whispered, "They own the heavens." At a temporary POW compound near Omaha Beach, an American intelligence sergeant noted in his report that the German captives seemed dazed, even offended. They were trained soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the army that had once stormed through France, crushed Poland, and stood at the gates of Moscow. Now they were being herded into barbed wire enclosures by men barely out of training camps. One captured major demanded to speak to an American officer. When brought before a lieutenant colonel, he asked, "Where is your main landing?" "Calais." The American just smiled. "You're standing in it." The major said nothing more. As prisoners were processed, Allied intelligence began its next phase, quiet psychological observation. Officers were questioned not just for tactics or positions, but for attitude. Most insisted the Normandy landings were temporary, that soon the 15th Army from Calais would sweep down and push the Allies back. They spoke of Hitler's secret weapons, of the Luftwaffe regrouping, of a counterattack that would come any day now. But their eyes told a different story. They were exhausted, confused, and shaken by what they had seen. The coordination, the power, the sheer weight of Allied logistics. A British interrogator later wrote, "They were not frightened men, only bewildered ones. They had seen the impossible and could not yet accept it." Within days, captured officers were shipped to England, to larger, more permanent camps. There the mood began to shift again. Behind the wire, officers who had commanded regiments and divisions now sat idle, comparing rumours. Some clung to hope that the Normandy front would stabilise. Others whispered darker thoughts that something enormous had changed, something irreversible. And soon that realisation would no longer come from rumours. It would come from the printed word, a simple newspaper placed in their hands by their captors. A few days later, the first copies arrived, Stars and Stripes. Times of London, the New York Times, each bearing headlines that left no room for doubt. Allied invasion, successful beachheads, secure Germany's Atlantic wall breached. For the first time since the landings, German officers could read what their own high command would never have told them, the full, unfiltered truth. And that truth was devastating. The first bundles arrived quietly in the back of a jeep. They were passed through the wire by Allied guards with casual ease, a gesture that seemed almost mocking to the German officers who received them. The papers creased, ink-smudged, smelling faintly of damp and diesel. But what mattered wasn't the paper. It was the words. For months, the officers had lived on a diet of carefully controlled information. Bulletins from Berlin, filtered reports, and Hitler's broadcasts proclaiming that the invasion has been contained. Even in captivity, they expected their captors to spin propaganda of their own. But what they read was something else entirely. Clear, factual, relentless. The Stars and Stripes described the largest sea-borne invasion in history, with nearly 7,000 vessels stretching from horizon to horizon. The Times of London printed a detailed map showing 5 beachheads Utah, Omaha Gold Juno Sword, each already expanding inland, and the New York Times listed division after division landing in waves so vast they defied imagination. One paper printed a single devastating sentence: "The Allies have established an unbreakable bridgehead on the coast of France." To the German officers, it was more than a statement, it was a revelation. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Beer, captured near Bayeux, stared at the front page for several minutes before whispering, "If this is true, we are finished." A nearby guard, overhearing him, simply nodded. The newspapers contained photographs too. Grainy black and white shots showing beaches blanketed with landing craft supply trucks already rolling inland and long lines of German prisoners being marched to the rear. One image in particular, an aerial view of Omaha Beach, left the officers speechless. It looked less like a battlefield and more like a factory in motion. For a generation of officers trained to believe in precision, discipline, and iron will, the sheer scale of what they saw was beyond comprehension. The Allies hadn't just landed an army, they'd moved an entire nation across the sea. Major Krauss, once defiant in his bunker, now sat silently under a dim camp lamp. He traced his finger across a printed map of Normandy, following the black arrows of Allied advance from the beaches toward Caen, toward Saint-Lô, toward Cherbourg. Each arrow felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into his chest. "Impossible," he whispered. "No army could move that fast." A fellow officer corrected him softly. No German army could. For the first time, they began to understand that the war wasn't simply being lost on the battlefield. It had been lost long before D-Day, in the factories, the shipyards, the skies. The invasion was merely the moment when that truth became visible. That night, the newspapers were passed hand to hand around the barracks. Some officers laughed bitterly. Others argued that the reports were exaggerated, that Allied propaganda was inflating the numbers. But as the hours passed, the laughter faded. There were too many details, too much consistency, too much truth in the photographs. No one could fake that many ships, that many men, that much motion. In one corner of the barracks, a young Luftwaffe lieutenant folded his paper neatly and said, "If the Führer says this is false, he is lying to himself." No one contradicted him. The next morning the guards noticed something different. The arrogance was gone. Where once the prisoners had stood, stiff-backed, quoting orders and promising a counterattack, they now moved quietly, subdued, thoughtful, almost hollow. Because the war had changed for them, not with a surrender or a defeat, but with a headline. Over the following days, more newspapers arrived. The Manchester Guardian, the Chicago Tribune, even neutral reports reprinted from Switzerland and Sweden. Each one peeled away another layer of denial. For the German officers behind barbed wire, the war they thought they understood was dissolving before their eyes. They had been raised to believe in Kriegsführung, the art of warfare through speed, precision, and discipline. But what they now read about D-Day revealed something far greater, something beyond any military doctrine they had ever studied. Industrial warfare on a scale they could not match. The papers detailed artificial harbours called mulberries, built and floated across the channel like pieces of a giant puzzle assembled off the Normandy coast in a matter of days. They read about Pluto pipeline, under the ocean, a fuel line stretching from England to France, pumping thousands of gallons a day to feed the Allied advance. They learned that the Allies had landed not only soldiers but entire infrastructure systems: bulldozers, cranes, power generators, mobile bakeries, even field laundries. To men who had fought in Russia, starving and freezing, scraping for ammunition, it sounded like science fiction. Lieutenant Colonel Bear studied one article describing the U.S. Army's logistics chain: fleets of Liberty ships unloading in rotation, vast supply depots in southern England, and aerial convoys that never stopped flying. He turned to his fellow officer and said, half in awe, half in despair, This is not a war of men anymore. It is a war of machines. For years, German officers had been taught that the Wehrmacht's efficiency and tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantage. They prided themselves on fighting smarter, faster with less. But now the numbers in those newspaper columns shattered that illusion. The United States alone was producing one bomber every hour, one tank every 20 minutes, and enough ammunition in a week to supply the entire Eastern Front for a month. The German economy, strangled by Allied bombing and resource shortages, couldn't keep up. One captain, a logistics officer from the 352nd Infantry Division, stared at a report describing how Allied engineers rebuilt entire roads and bridges within days of landing, laughed bitterly and said, "We take weeks to get one truckload of fuel to the front. They build a city overnight." Another officer, a veteran of Africa, pointed to a photograph of a British harbour teeming with cargo ships. "Do you know what this means?" he murmured. "They can lose half of it and still win." It was a moment of collective revelation and humiliation. The officers began to understand that what they had faced on the beaches wasn't just superior strategy. It was the weight of entire continents, America's industry, Britain's engineering, Canada's manpower, and the global logistics of an empire. For years, German officers had mocked the Allies as soft, slow, over-mechanized. Now reading these reports, they realized that mechanization had won the war, before the first rifle fired. In one camp, an American guard overheard a conversation between two captured colonels. One asked, "How many tanks did we have in France in 1940? "Maybe 1,000, the other replied. "And how many did they bring now?" The colonel pointed at the newspaper. "They don't even count them anymore." That single line, "They don't even count them anymore," said everything. For the German officers, it was the moment pride began to turn to resignation. They could no longer pretend that D-Day was an isolated event. It was proof that the Allies could move mountains, build oceans, and sustain a war effort that no human courage could stop. The newspapers had become more than reading material. They were mirrors, reflecting a truth that every officer had long suspected but never dared admit. Germany's defeat was no longer about the battlefield. It was about the factories. And as the barbed wire glinted under the summer sun, those officers sat quietly, staring at headlines that spelled out what no order from Berlin would ever acknowledge. The Reich had been outproduced, outplanned, and outlasted. By late June, the air in the POW camps had changed. The swagger that had once defined captured German officers, the sharp salutes, the clipped arrogance, the cold confidence, had begun to dissolve. Something quieter had taken its place. At first the guards thought it was simple fatigue, but among the prisoners themselves, it was something deeper, a kind of awakening that crept in not through gunfire but through words. Every new issue of Allied newspapers carried another reminder that the invasion had not stalled. Reports spoke of Cherbourg falling of Caen, under siege of thousands of tons of supplies, pouring ashore each day. The Germans had assumed the beaches would become killing fields. Instead, they had become ports, living arteries, feeding an unstoppable advance. For the officers reading these reports, the shock wasn't only military, it was psychological. They had been raised on a code, the Wehrmacht's belief in endurance, precision, and tactical brilliance. They believed a disciplined army could overcome anything. But D-Day had proven something terrifying. Discipline alone meant nothing against a force that could outnumber, outproduce, and outlast them 100 times over. Inside the camp barracks, long debates broke out after evening roll call. Some men clung desperately to Hitler's promises of a counterattack. They spoke of the new weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, the jet fighters said to be in production. Others listened silently, eyes fixed on the ground. Colonel Beer, who had once commanded hundreds of men now, spent hours sitting by the fence newspaper folded in his lap. When another officer asked what he thought of the so-called secret weapons, Bear just said, "You can't bomb a harbour made of concrete and steel with dreams." The words spread through the camp like an echo. Some officers began to confess in hushed tones that they had suspected the truth. For months that Germany could never win a war against the combined might of Britain, America, and Russia. But saying it aloud had been impossible. To question the Reich, even in private, had meant accusations, punishment, or worse. Now, within the safety of captivity, they could finally think, and what they thought filled them with a hollow kind of dread. A Luftwaffe major, leafing through a British newspaper, stopped at a photograph of endless Allied bombers lined wing to wing. "Over England," he whispered. "That is what broke us. Not the soldiers, the sky." He was right. The skies belonged to the Allies. Another officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, shook his head in disbelief as he read about the steady Allied advance. "In both France and Italy," he said quietly. "Russians from the east, the Americans from the west. We are trapped in the middle, and our leaders tell us we are still winning." The younger officers didn't argue anymore. Even the most loyal among them could see what the older men now knew. D-Day had shown the world that Germany's myth of invincibility was broken. What unsettled them most wasn't defeat itself, but how calm the Allies seemed about victory. There were no grand proclamations, no hysteria, just methodical progress day after day, as if an empire were reclaiming a debt long overdue. To the German officers, that quiet, steady determination was terrifying. It meant the Allies were fighting not for glory, but for finality. By mid-July, Guards reported that many of the POWs no longer asked for news. They no longer argued about where the next counterattack would come. Some simply sat in silence, staring at the papers they had already read a dozen times, because somewhere between the headlines and the photographs they had found the one truth their own command would never admit: the war was already over. They were just the last ones to realize it. In every war there comes a moment when soldiers realize that what they've been told no longer matches what they see. For the captured German officers, that moment came not on a battlefield, but in the quiet rustle of newspaper pages. Inside the POW camps of southern England, the evenings had grown strangely still. The guards would finish their rounds, the lights dimmed, and the only sound left was the whisper of paper men reading by lantern light, hunched over columns of ink that carried more power than any artillery barrage. The stars and stripes ran full-page spreads on the Allied advance. Inland, it showed the front stretching deep into Normandy, the Americans pushing towards Saint-Lô, the British near Caen, the Canadians linking up between them. The tone wasn't boastful. It was factual, precise, almost clinical. That cold precision made it even more devastating to read for. The German officers, every paragraph was a blow to their old sense of order. The lines they had memorized from propaganda, broadcasts "Our brave soldiers hold firm," "The enemy is repelled," "The invasion is contained," were collapsing in real time. Now they could trace the Allied progress across maps printed in black and white. Line by line, town by town, week by week. Each morning brought new confirmation that what they'd once dismissed as temporary setbacks was becoming a continental avalanche. One camp interpreter, a young American sergeant of German descent, later recalled, "They read those papers like court sentences. Some would stare at the maps for hours, others tore them apart, but none of them denied what they saw." The newspapers weren't chosen at random. Allied intelligence officers understood the psychological warfare value of truth. They didn't need to lie. The facts themselves were crushing enough. Some papers printed photographs of the Allied war machine in motion, convoys snaking through the Norman countryside, supply ships anchored by the dozens and rows of smiling troops posing with captured German equipment. For the officers behind the wire, it was a study in contrast. They thought of their own divisions underfed, undersupplied, retreating. And here on paper was the opposite. An enemy that seemed limitless. Captain Ernst Vogel, once a logistics officer, stared for a long time at a photograph of Allied landing craft unloading trucks onto a beach. Finally, he said softly to no one in particular, "We have been living in a dream, and they have been living in a factory." Some prisoners grew angry. They accused the newspapers of exaggeration of propaganda, but even their anger had the edge of fear, because deep down they knew what they were reading matched what they'd seen: the endless skies filled with planes, the unbroken chain of Allied convoys, the steady rhythm of artillery that never ran out of shells. Others, especially older officers who had fought since 1939, reacted differently. They didn't shout or argue. They folded the papers neatly, set them aside, and sat still for a long time. For them, it was not rage that came, it was recognition. They realized they had spent years in a war of illusions. Illusions of superiority, of destiny, of unbreakable command. Now, in those black and white photographs, those illusions were dying. One guard later wrote in his diary, "I watched them lose their war one page at a time." He wasn't exaggerating. For many of those officers, the real defeat didn't come when they surrendered their weapons, it came when they surrendered their certainty. The papers told them what their superiors never would, that Paris would fall, that the Western Front was breaking, that Russia was only weeks from crossing into East Prussia. The world they had believed in, the Reich, that had promised 1,000 years, was crumbling in print right before their eyes. A few days later, the camp's chaplain wrote in his report, "They are quieter now. It is not the quiet of discipline, it is the quiet of men who have read their own ending," and that was the cruelest irony of all. The final defeat of the German officer corps did not come from a bullet or a bomb. It came from truth, delivered on a piece of paper, folded neatly, handed through a fence. By the time summer turned to autumn in 1944, the POW camps holding captured German officers had changed. The fences, the guard towers, the watchlights, they were all the same. But inside, the air felt different. The loud debates and rigid drills that once filled the compound had faded. Now there was quiet, not peace quiet. The men inside were still officers. They still carried themselves with the habits of command, shoulders, straight voices, clipped manners, formal. But something deeper had shifted. They no longer talked about victory. They no longer talked about holding the line. Instead, they spoke of survival, of families back home, of what would happen when Germany lost the war completely. Every evening after roll call, small groups would gather in corners of the barracks. Some read newspapers aloud. Others shared letters from home, censored and torn but still precious. It was during these moments that reflection began, slow, painful, and often unspoken. Captain Vogel, who had once believed logistics could save the Reich, began keeping a journal. He wrote not of tactics or supply routes, but of guilt. He wrote of how easy it was to believe. The machinery of war was unstoppable until he saw the faces of the young soldiers who had died trying to defend an impossible dream. In another hut, Lieutenant Krauss, a former staff officer from Army Group West, had started translating American newspaper reports into German for his fellow prisoners. At first, he did it with a trace of irony, scoffing at the way the Allies portrayed themselves as liberators. But as the weeks passed, his tone softened. He began pausing more, often rereading sentences aloud, as if searching for something he had missed all along. He once stopped mid-sentence and said quietly, "Perhaps this is what truth looks like when it stops caring, whether we believe it." Some of the younger officers didn't take it well. They clung to fragments of hope, rumors of new weapons, secret negotiations, miracle rescues. But even those rumors were losing their shine. Every day brought new headlines. Allies liberate Paris-Warsaw. Rising Russians break through the Vistula. Each one drove another nail into the coffin of the world they had sworn to defend. One evening, a Red Cross delegate brought fresh newspapers into the camp. The front page showed a photo of French civilians cheering American tanks in Paris. Someone passed the paper down the row of bunks. By the time it reached the end, it was wet from rain or tears, no one knew. That night, silence fell early, even the guards. They noticed it. The men didn't argue, didn't sing, didn't pace the yard. They just sat watching the lantern light flicker across the wooden walls. Some stared at nothing for so long it was as if they were watching their own memories crumble. For the first time, the scale of D-Day of Operation Overlord had become something more than a military fact. It was a mirror showing them what Germany had truly faced and what it had lost long before the beaches of Normandy. The German officers had spent their lives mastering war maps, strategy, logistics, command. But here, behind barbed wire, they were finally learning the hardest lesson of all. That knowledge without truth is blindness, and that in war blindness is fatal. For many, that realization came too late. For some, it became the first step toward something resembling redemption. But for all of them, it began with a single newspaper headline passed hand to hand under the grey light of an English morning. In the grand story of the Second World War, we often measure defeat in battles lost in tanks, destroyed, or in armies overrun. But for the German, officers who read about D-Day from behind barbed wire defeat came in a quieter form, one that no after-action report could capture. It came in the stillness of those English camps, where the hum of reality drowned out years of illusion. They had entered the war believing in precision hierarchy and command a world where logic and discipline could shape history. But in those summer months of 1944, they saw that even the most disciplined army cannot stand against a world united in both industry and will. The invasion of Normandy had been more than a military operation. It was the visible proof of something Germany's leaders had refused to believe: that the Allies could organize, build, and fight on a scale far beyond imagination. While the Reich was shrinking, the Allies were multiplying. Every jeep, every crate of ammunition, every ship anchored off those beaches was a message that said simply, "You cannot win this." And when those officers finally read that message, not from a general's lips, but from the printed words of a newspaper, something inside them broke. The arrogance, the faith in invincibility, the idea that Germany's destiny was unshakable. It all fell away, leaving only the truth. Some of them later said that their war ended not on the battlefield, but on that day they read the Allied reports of D-Day's success, because for the first time they understood the scale not just of the invasion, but of the lie they had been living. They saw that the Reich had been built on belief and belief alone, and belief once confronted by undeniable reality collapses faster than any fortress. As one former Luftwaffe officer wrote years later, we had been told the enemy was strong but fractured. What we saw in those papers was unity, purpose, and power. That was the day I knew we were finished. So when we think of D-Day, we picture the beaches, the soldiers, the smoke, the chaos. But somewhere far from Normandy, in a quiet camp surrounded by English fields, the battle was being fought in the minds of men who had once believed they could conquer the world, and in that battle too the Allies won. Because D-Day didn't just liberate France, it liberated truth. And when that truth finally crossed the wire printed in black and white, the officers of a fallen army saw perhaps for the first time what scale really meant.